it's really important that clinicians think about how specifically they can support clients in better coping with racism and discrimination in their everyday lives. This is an area that we are still learning about how to do effectively, but there are some really clear and relatively simple practices that we know help clients who are struggling with discrimination or identity-related stressors. One of the most obvious components is creating a space for clients to be able to process what these moments are like. Many individuals who face discrimination and racism experience them in isolation and don't necessarily process what the experience felt like, the pain that they associate with it, and how it might even change how they view their relationships, how they view the world. So therapists can create a safe space for clients to process how events related to race and racism, how living in a world where they see constant clues and cues of white supremacy, how these things actually shape how they feel on a daily basis. And so that's one piece, that processing element. However, in addition to processing things in therapy, one clear way that research suggests people cope with discrimination is by processing that with similar others, people who share an identity like them. And one challenge is that some people live in environments where they may have very little access to similar others. One thing that I've worked with some clients on who might feel a little bit more isolated, maybe they don't have a lot of connection with people who share the identities that they struggle with, is to actually support the client in thinking about how they may be able to forge those connections in the future. There are oftentimes major limitations. We can't change necessarily the demographics of the workplace environment or school environments or even neighborhood or state that people live in. But usually within every context, there are decisions that people can make that can bring them into contact with more like-minded or similarly identifying people, or might keep them in environments that are more hostile or unforgiving to their identities. And so working with clients to actively help them engage in behaviors that cultivate a community of support can be a really important intervention that can help support the individual, even outside of therapy, in processing these everyday events. You know, I think about this issue of access to similar others and the importance of processing both in and out of the therapy room, in some ways because of my own experiences. I grew up in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri. I attended a predominantly white elementary school, middle school, and high school. And I actually grew up in a neighborhood that neighbored Ferguson, Missouri, a place that has become more well-known recently after the brutal and horrific shooting of Mike Brown, who was killed with his hands in the air, right, in the middle of the street by a police officer in Ferguson. I lived about 1.5 miles from the site where that ultimately happened when I was a child and adolescent. And I was, probably not surprisingly, exposed to lots of harmful, limited, stereotypical assumptions about what it means to be Black. I also, in my mid-teens, began to struggle with my sexual orientation. I was beginning to grapple with the fact that no matter how much I wanted to be, I was not straight, and that probably would have some major implications for my life, for how I was viewed, for what kind of relationships I built, for what people thought of me. And that brought up a lot of challenges for me, right? I was already struggling with navigating what it meant to be a Black man in America and in the Midwest and in this, you know, predominantly white school in the suburbs. But now I was also grappling with what it meant to be gay or queer. And in fact, per my interest in intersectionality, I was dealing with the combination of those, right? Beginning to think about the fact that I didn't see much representation of people that looked like me within the local LGBT community. And in fact, there were racial and racist stereotypes of Black people within the LGBT community where I grew up. I also was aware that I might face some rejection from the Black community, a community that was really important to me, that I relied on for support in many ways. So it created quite a conundrum, identity-related conundrum for me. And the thing that saved me, honestly, was getting involved somewhat by chance, honestly, in a really thoughtful, progressive youth program. I participated in this sort of social justice summer program that intentionally brought together a diverse group of teenagers, diverse with relation to race, to gender, to class, to sexual orientation. And there I was able to have really powerful and important conversations about how we see one another across these dimensions of difference, and how we see ourselves as well. The negative views that sometimes we internalize about what it means to be Black or working class or transgender or a woman, any of these things. And during that time, I was able to find adult role models who had identities like me. I was able to process my fears and concerns and confusions with similar others, even of my same age. I was able to build a more positive sense of self. And I'm confident that this experience, and in particular, having the space for processing and having access to similar others, prevented me from what otherwise might have been a major mental health struggle as I navigated being Black and queer. Most people struggling with one or more aspects of their identity don't ultimately have access to such affirming spaces, but they really need it. And this is where, even if they don't have a space like the one I had, therapists can partially provide that in the therapy room, but also can give clients the education and the motivation of how to cobble together those pieces outside of therapy as well. I want to share, there are a lot of ways that clients cope with stigma and prejudice. One of the important strategies that clinicians can use is to work with clients to evaluate the coping strategies that they are already using and that they rely on, to examine whether they are actually helpful or whether they're just familiar and are actually causing them more problems. And so the issue here is that we as humans often develop coping skills when we're young, when we're in extreme circumstances, sometimes with very few resources or options or knowledge of how to cope. And the problem is we keep using them year after year, even once we're older and in less extreme situations and have more resources. And we do that because it's simply ingrained and automatic. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say I'm working with a client who's struggling with challenges in the workplace. Maybe they feel tons of work stress and they find that they either leave or get fired from jobs often. They're dealing with depression and anxiety related to these concerns, and they present to me for treatment. And we've been working together for a while, and I might be really curious about the connection between this experience today and a fact that this client told me about their time in school, specifically that they encountered race-related bullying when they were in middle school. Right? So I might just ask them really openly, how does racial bullying that you experienced in middle school shape how you view white people today? Right? And that person could theoretically begin to talk about how it puts them on guard all the time. It makes them sometimes expect to be rejected even before anything happens, right? They walk in the room on guard, ready for racism because they've experienced so much of it in the past. They may also share that it keeps them from forming close relationships with white people, right? A protective strategy that many people who have been victimized by racist bullying or harassment, a strategy they may take on. And so I could tie all of this to their core concern, right? That they have this work stress, frequently change their job. I might say something like, you shared before that most people at your current job are white, and that most of the workplaces you've worked in have been predominantly white. How does this being on guard factor into these challenges you've had at work? Or does it at all? Now, we have to be open here, right? You even heard at the end I said, does it at all? Because we could find that this is not relevant for the client, that it doesn't resonate. We also could find that being vigilant about race and racism is actually helpful to the client because it protects them. But there's an opportunity for a real breakthrough here, right? The client could begin to conclude that this way of coping is outdated. That it helped them in middle school, right, to close off the relationships and be on guard. But that now, not only is it unnecessary, but it might be sabotaging their relationships at work, their progression at work, and their ability to keep a job. So, but either way, regardless of how the client responds, if you're exploring coping mechanisms and talking about how some might be adaptive and some might be outdated, you always want to validate that the reliance that we have, that we all tend to have on our older coping mechanisms is normal, it's common, and it's what humans do, right? Until we have the space and opportunity to reflect and to kind of hold our strategies up to the light and say, is this really helping or hindering me? Right. And from this work, you can imagine with this client, I might then, sessions down the line, begin to imagine or even help them practice other ways to cope with racism. Ways besides expecting it, being on guard for it, and avoiding close relationships. Right? We can come up with a new action plan that can free them up and might actually help resolve some of their core concerns around the workplace.